What is that?
This is my silly gooey silly putty, and it's very gooey, golly, gang, and it's got gooey, and I take and it's very stretchy. You see?
I see that. So this one, you didn't make this one though, right?
No.
This one came in this. But this is your Easter scented putty. It's supposed to smell like melon. Does it smell like melon? Does it smell like melon to you?
Yeah. Smells like nothing.
Smells like nothing. All right, so you can do something fun with this while the students watch the video, and then we'll show them after, okay? Have a good lesson. We'll see you back in a minute. Okay, welcome back. Sending good vibes to you and your family. Hoping everyone is safe and healthy wherever you are watching this video from. Congrats, friends. As we said in our last video, World War II unit is complete. Most of you did very well. Those of you who are missing any assignments from that unit, please do not spend any time making up any of the assignments unless it's the quiz. We want to just focus on moving forward. The best way to improve your overall grade is to just keep moving forward and keeping up with the assignments for our new unit. Of course, if the World War II quiz is something you're missing or you would like to do better on, you need to make up that quiz or send me a message if you want to retake the quiz, and you can retake it for a better score. So we're continuing, as I said in the last video, this is our new unit, the Cold War, which was a war between the Soviet Union and the United States. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about this idea of why it's called a Cold War today. So we're going to change the visuals on this. The new unit is going to look like this. We're going to call it the Cold War. We'll throw some ice in there, and instead of the flames, we'll give it sort of a snow effect there. The Soviet Union versus the United States. And as I just mentioned, we'll talk more in a moment about why it's called the Cold War. So, our second aim for this unit, why did the United States and the Soviet Union become rivals after World War II rather than remaining allies? You should remember that both the Soviet Union and the United States were friends during World War II. Both fought on the winning side of the war, the Allies, which included the US, Great Britain, France, Soviet Union, China, to defeat Nazi Germany and to defeat Japan as well. But after World War II ends, the Soviet Union and the United States are not friends anymore. They become rivals, and they go through this long conflict called the Cold War, which we will reveal the meaning of that name in a few minutes. All right, so to go forward, we've got to go backwards first. So our review is after World War II, a major goal of the Soviet Union was to shield itself from another invasion from the West, meaning Western Europe. Why did the Soviet Union need to shield itself from invasion? Consider previous conflicts. So there's a sentence starter here. It says, the Soviet Union had to shield itself from invasion because, and you should be thinking about how Hitler invaded the Soviet Union and how Napoleon had previously invaded Russia at the time. And you can also think back a little bit to World War I and what the experience of World War I was like for Russia, as it was called at the time, before it got out of the war. And in all of these cases, there was a common problem that led to the Soviet Union being invaded, and that's this Northern European plain. You should remember this came up when we were doing our Battle of France lesson from our last unit. The Northern European plain is a very flat area in Europe in which it is easy to travel across if you are trying to invade another country versus trying to go across mountains, which are very difficult to invade. So here's a map of Europe. You can see Western Europe on the map labeled, and you can see the Soviet Union in the east labeled as well. And the Northern European plain is all of that green on the map. The brown are the mountains, the green is the Northern European plain, and you can see that historically it's easy to get from Western Europe into the Soviet Union or Russia for an invasion. Now, of course, dealing with the weather there can be very challenging, as we saw for Napoleon, as we saw for Hitler and the Nazis. The Russian winter can be very difficult to deal with. But in terms of invading Russia, it is vulnerable to attack because there is no natural barrier protecting it, right? So, because it lacked natural Western barriers, Russia fell victim to each of its neighbors in turn. So, normally in class, we would discuss creating a strategy that would help the Soviet Union protect itself from more invasions along its western border. Oftentimes, students will come up with this idea that they should focus on this region between Western Europe and the Soviet Union. So rather than being invaded, perhaps if they focus on what's going on in this area, they could stop an invasion from occurring. Some ideas, students have said, well, build a really big wall there, place a lot of troops there, build some type of barrier, some type of defense system there. I'm going to show you in a political cartoon what the Soviet Union actually did end up doing, and I think we'll be able to figure out from there what the strategy was that they used. So, based on this political cartoon, how did the Soviet Union shield itself from another invasion from the West? We're going to look at the cartoon a little bigger. We're going to point out a few things here on the cartoon. First, I'm going to point out we got to focus on the key. The key has labels for us to help us understand what's going on this map/cartoon. So, Soviet Russia is labeled black there, okay? I'm going to underline that, Soviet Russia. And in the area that is shaded in black, there's this guy right here. You should recognize him. Looks like Stalin. Now, moving along, as we look at Stalin, he's sort of like reaching out across the map, reaching from the Soviet Union from the east out towards the west. And in his hand, he has these flags, and it looks like he is trying to pin the flags on the map of Europe. And on the flags, you should recognize the symbol that's there, the hammer and sickle, which of course we learned represents communism, as the hammer represents the workers and the sickle represents the peasants, who are unified in a communist society in which everyone shares everything equally. That's the idea, right? Okay. So he's pinning these flags. Now, is he taking over that land? Let's take a look back at the key here. So I'm going to underline a couple more things in there. So some of the shaded countries represent countries in Soviet political, economic, and strategic bloc. And some of the countries that are shaded in are countries with communist or communist-influenced governments. So it's not that these countries became a part of the Soviet Union. They would be shaded in black. But Stalin, the Soviet Union, worked to influence those countries to be communist so that they would be allies of the Soviet Union rather than potential enemies of the Soviet Union. So what they've done is they've created this barrier in a way where they can say, okay, if we're going to get invaded from the West, from the Americans' allies, countries like France, Great Britain, a portion of Germany, which is called West Germany, we'll talk about that in a later unit. If we're going to be invaded from the West, those countries would have to get through all of these other communist countries like East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, etc. And the Eastern countries became known as the Eastern Bloc. Those are the Soviet allies. So this was one of their strategies to prevent another invasion from the West, is to make this barrier of other communist allies that they had. And you can see on this map that the communist countries are on the eastern side. The non-communist countries are all on the western side. And there's this line that is labeled dividing them. And the line, or the border between them, is called the Iron Curtain. Now, that's another important focus of today's lesson. So the Iron Curtain is a term that was created by Winston Churchill. He said, an iron curtain has descended across the continent, meaning Europe. Behind that line lie all the states of Central and Eastern Europe, in the Soviet sphere. And you should remember sphere from when we talked about spheres of influence. So the countries in the eastern part of Europe are in the Soviet sphere of influence. The Soviet Union has not taken those countries, but they are heavily influencing those countries and controlling what those countries do. Why would Winston Churchill call this border an iron curtain? We're going to look at another political cartoon for a moment, help illustrate this idea of an iron curtain. So I see in the cartoon here, I see some labels. And I want to start with the biggest label that we see is Europe. We can't see all of the word Europe. We see part of it, and that's to symbolize that part of Europe is on one side of this big curtain or barrier running through the cartoon, and part of it's on the other side. So we know on one side is Eastern Europe, eastern side of this map of Europe, and we know it's communist, and we can see the communist flag in this cartoon. And we know that this other side then must be the western part of Europe, and it is non-communist. In Western Europe, we see that there is some damage from World War II in the background, and in Eastern Europe, we see that some of the damage that also probably occurred there is being repaired through rapid industrialization under communist government. And there's this iron curtain that is dividing the two sides. And we see on the iron curtain, it says no admittance by order Joe, meaning Joseph Stalin. And this person that you see trying to peek under the curtain is Winston Churchill, who came up with the phrase iron curtain, right? So this curtain of iron, right? I want you to think about iron. Is it a soft material or is it a strong material? It's very strong. Iron is not easy to break or to get through. And Winston Churchill is trying to look under the curtain. It's very difficult for him to see what's going on the other side of the curtain there. So this iron curtain is like a very strong divide between the East and the West. It's difficult to get through. The things that are happening on one side are difficult to see, and the things that are happening on the communist side certainly are heavily influenced by the Soviet Union. And I think it's also interesting that to think of iron when it rusts turns red, right? And so this curtain, not only is it very strong, but it's also alluding to this idea of red, which we talked about, red representing communism, the Red Army, of course, with the communists in the Russian Civil War. All right, so let's do some defining here. Here's some vocab. So, Cold War, a state of hostility between the US and the Soviet Union in the decades after World War II. This lasted for a very long time, right? For about 35 years. From 1946 to 1991, the Cold War continued. And in the Cold War, there was no direct fighting between the United States and the Soviet Union. There was only indirect fighting happening. It's not called the Cold War because it's cold in the Soviet Union. It's not the weather. A hot war would be a war that involves direct fighting between two countries. World War II was a very hot war. Lots of fighting, lots of explosions, lots of death directly between the countries involved. In a Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union never actually fought each other directly. They only indirectly fought each other, and they used other countries to do the fighting. So we'll look at some wars later in this unit where in Vietnam, for example, in Korea, for example, other parts of the world, the two countries never fought each other, but they supported opposing sides, one side being communist, one side being non-communist or capitalists. So that's why it became known as the Cold War, because the two countries were treating each other coldly and they were never fighting each other directly in a hot war. I'm going to go back to the years again. I said 46 to 91 is 35 years. I think it's 45 years doing the math off the top of my head. Lastly, Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain is the boundary that separated the communist countries in the East, who were allies of the Soviet Union, from the mostly democratic capitalist nations of Western Europe, which were mostly American allies during the Cold War. So the Iron Curtain divides the communist countries in the East from the non-communist countries in the West. Soviet Union likes communism. They're supporting the East. The United States does not like communism, likes capitalism. The United States is supporting the countries in the West. Okay. So today's task, you're going to read this excerpt from an article about the Iron Curtain, and then you have two options for your task. We're going to do the activity where you come up with an alternate name. We've done it in the past for songs when we've used a song to analyze a historical event. Today you're going to come up with an alternate title for either the Iron Curtain. So you'll define it. The Iron Curtain was. Another name for the Iron Curtain could be. And whatever you choose, you need to make sure it explains, it connects to this division between communist Eastern Europe and capitalist Western Europe. Your other option for your task is to rename the Cold War. The Cold War was, so define the Cold War, and then create another name that also symbolizes the hostility, the rivalry between the Soviet Union and the US without any direct fighting. What other name could you call it? So those are your two options for the task. As always, don't forget, we're sending good vibes to you and your family. World War II is done. Don't make up any of those previous assignments unless it's the quiz. Just focus on completing all of the tasks for this new unit. If you do need to make up the quiz, do that as soon as possible. And if you want to retake the World War II quiz, let me know. Now let's get back to closing out our video with Joaquin. What did you hear?
Lightning!
Wow, was it loud?
Yeah.
And what did you end up doing with the slime stuff?
This is Spider-Man's web.
Okay.
And this is Spider-Man caught a bad guy.
He caught his car in the web?
No, he caught a bad guy. This is Spider-Man's car.
That's Spider-Man's car?
This is the bad guy's car.
That's the bad guy's car?
Uh-huh.
And what's all these colors in the slime?
That's the confetti.
Oh, did you mix the slimes together?
Uh-huh.
The confetti slime and the melon slime? Uh-huh. Does it smell like melon yet?
Okay. It doesn't smell very like lemon.
Should we say bye to everyone?
Bye.
Okay. Bye, friends.
Bye. What's your names, everyone?